Hi, this is Truth in Automation, the deep dive, and I am your guest uh, co-host, Ed Fullman. I'm a Chief Solution Delivery Officer for Veritas Automata.
I'm
And
Saurabh Sarkar, principal scientist.
so today our topic is AI augmented DevOps, and just a conversation about that topic and how it could work and what the implications, strategic and technical, are, and some anecdotes about how we're doing this kind of thing today as well. I'm sure it'll seep into what we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting field, right? In previous episodes, we talked about AI as a tool,
Right.
like, the algorithm part of it, the agentic piece of it, like what AI does, what it does. But you being in this, the world where you are managing big projects and things like that, delivering solutions, how do you see AI fit in that whole environment?
Well, I think there's demonstrations and possibilities and hope and anticipation around agentic
Hmm.
results inside of especially DevOps.
Right.
And there's some companies that are providing packages that do that kind of thing.
Right.
But it's a challenging world in the real world, right? I mean, like for example, we have projects with dozens of clusters,
Mhm.
right? So if you were going to automate um, with an AI inside those clusters, do you give AI access to all the clusters
Right.
for all the clients on our platform? I mean, these become like real world security issues and
Right.
real world operational issues. So I think there are commercial platforms like, for example, Datadog and others that are blending in AI around more detection,
Hmm.
and it's agentic, but it's not intended to actually go fix something or
Right.
maybe suggest a fix.
Hmm.
And then in very small controlled bites,
Right.
take an action, right? Or support an action,
Right.
like some kind of refresh of a pod or something like that. But to me, I think this is similar to the other conversations you guys have had around uh, using an LLM um, in code generation, or the idea of software development,
Correct.
right?
Yeah.
And where does that all fit? And I think for DevOps, it's pretty much the same as other engineering. I mean, DevOps is development and operations,
Correct.
right? So there's a big component of it where you're developing self-service for the developers on your team, and
Mhm.
you're automating CI/CD and other release kind of capabilities. And there is a bit more structure in that world and limitations than maybe the wide open world of like coding something from scratch in a base language.
Yeah,
So
you bring up testing because that could be a very interesting
yeah,
application of generating test cases and stuff like that. But the question I always think when I think of AI generated test case, how do you explain the AI, what it is, what it is testing for, what is the source code going to do, so that it generates those relevant edge cases and even the
yeah,
the happy path for per se. How
yeah,
do you kind of tell the AI where does it stem from?
yeah. It's a good question,
Yeah.
because you wouldn't want to just say, okay, go build me some test cases without giving it some structure and some
Correct.
artifacts
Right, right.
to
What
do
to
it.
test for, what to look for, and things like
Right.
that. Does it stem from requirement, or is it the code base itself that it needs to have to generate those
Yeah, I
tests?
mean, this is where you get into asking the wrong question, right? I
Right,
mean, if you're asking a question like, okay, make this more performant,
right.
what exactly are you saying?
Correct. Yeah.
Right? You can get something out. It's like a an episode of Twilight Zone or something. Something really bad could happen from that question.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
think you're onto it, though. I mean, whether we're talking about DevOps or whether we're talking about development of applications or architecture, um, to me, uh, it's this is going to be a changing landscape over the next 5 years.
Right.
I've done some work on trying to predict over the next 5 years the changes that are going to occur each
Hmm.
year, this year, next year, and so forth, and try to understand how that affects our business and the business of our clients in the idea of augmentation of the people that they already have. Does it create a multiplier effect? And what is that? And can we quantify it?
Mhm.
And what tools do we need to get good at over time? Because I think if you look out 5 years from now, given the changes that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years, one would expect that we would continue at this velocity of like things
Right.
getting better and better and better and better. Maybe that's really unrealistic,
Mhm.
but clearly there are opportunities today for DevOps and other engineers to um, multiply their effect by um, using AI in a very structured way that should represent the way they're working already,
Mhm.
right? I mean, you don't just necessarily skip the code,
Mhm.
bypass like requirement development and design and test case development and stuff like that. You don't necessarily just do that. I mean, and skip right ahead to like build me this,
Right. Yeah.
right? So, the view that I and others have right now is that um, we have to take this in steps. So if you think about product management, that step,
Mhm.
it's a place where we want to essentially take the deliverables from that step, see if we can augment with AI to produce them. Given the fact that it's mainly a lot of words
Mhm.
and it's a translation of
Correct.
other words
Yes.
that are
Mhm.
provided in, whether it's feedback from customers or architectural feedback or performance feedback to the point of making something more performant. All this feedback loop stuff today happens, and some human coalesces that into a requirement,
Right.
some kind of epic, and then it's handed off to a developer at that point and a program manager,
Mhm.
right? So I think you've got to look at the entire development team,
Right.
program management, product management, the developer, and the QA environment and QA people, and maybe even the architectural people, and say all of your artifacts should be generated in a structured way,
Right.
maybe more structured than we
Mhm.
do today, less free form, so that they're clear, they're really clear.
Right.
And then if you create these artifacts at each step, you could theoretically put them in the best tool available at the time
Right.
to wash them in there and come up with another artifact, possibly code or something like that. But right now it seems like the big opportunity is in actually product management,
Mhm.
a little bit in program management, and then a lot in QA automation, generating test data, to actually doing tests around performance and stuff like that, and getting the AI involved in suggesting how to build that, or maybe even structures to do it. Um, but yeah, I think that and just kind of the general concept of lean development
Yeah.
is where we got to focus our time.
As you were walking through this is why I like your thought leadership on the product management. I was visualizing we have a little robot which builds stuff like a house, right? Automated way. But if you feed in a bad blueprint and you don't do the inspection in the end,
Right.
it may have built it in a day, which takes a couple of months to build, right? But now you don't have a house that is ready to be used, right?
Right.
Same as LLM, if you think about it, prompt engineering is you're providing requirements to it to generate certain things and answers in certain way and format within your guideline. That's where the requirements come into play in a
Yeah.
project management role, right? We talk a lot about code generation,
Yeah.
in the news in general. We have cursors, we have co-pilots and things like that there. But the input to those things is still the requirements.
Yeah.
What is the problem you're trying to solve, right? So you did put a limelight on that entire upstream pipeline,
Yeah.
which is what problem are we trying to solve? How are we trying to solve this? If it is not crystal clear, and how we generate those artifacts, like you said,
Right.
the code itself wouldn't be like trash in, trash out, garbage in, garbage out, right? Now the garbage is not data but requirements. If it is not a valid requirement
Yeah.
that meets the actual problem, then the code itself cannot be blamed because the requirements were flawed in the first place.
Yeah.
So how do you solve that problem of ensuring the requirements are aligned with the problem that the tool was trying to solve, or the
Yeah.
project is trying to solve?
I mean, I think that this is basic lean startup
Mhm.
methodology type of planning,
Right.
right? Eric Rice, he developed this concept of lean startup, and the to boil it all down, it's about reducing uncertainty in your design
Mhm.
and ultimately feeding better information
Mhm.
into your process, your
Okay.
development process. So his whole one of his big contributions here is this idea that you want to do MVPs,
Right.
right? And you want to go, an MVP in this case is the least amount of coding possible to
Mhm.
get feedback. That's the whole point of it. It's not to put it into production. It's
Mhm.
to get feedback from the customer and say, I heard what you said. And a lot of times this information is very anecdotal,
Mhm.
right? So, and there's not a lot of it. So it's very sparse. So your risk is really high that you're
Mhm.
going to misinterpret,
Right.
right? Because somebody put a narrative together. Usually those are people on either end of the bell curve, right?
Mhm.
Really, really happy or really, really unhappy, never in the middle. Um, they're unhappy about one thing, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
And the continuum of everything that you've delivered them or something like that. So it's at that level, your uncertainty about solving that particular feedback for
Mhm.
that feedback is very risky. So
Mhm.
if you could reduce that risk, the way that Eric Rice has kind of pushed the industry is to say, let's build just enough to prove that point
Mhm.
and put it in front of a customer and see what they say. Do they say that's it?
Mhm.
Or do they say that's not it? And the value of that is enormous if you
Mhm.
think about doing that on a larger scale across your requirements. Because if you go through the process of actually building something
Right.
with bad information, to your point,
Mhm.
you're going to get to the end, like in a big waterfall at some level,
Right.
and end up with, unfortunately, the client said they don't like it,
You're right.
right?
Right.
And at that point, it's super expensive to
Mhm.
go back and fix it, especially if it's part of some integrated process. It's it's a real problem.
So let me quiz you on this one. So the model that you mentioned works pretty well when you are building a new product and something, but when you're building something integrated, like let's just say a payment gateway,
Yeah,
how would you do that? Like how would you test your
yeah,
concept in a lean way when it's in the middle of a river, right? You're setting something right at the when the whole business is flowing
yeah.
through the pipeline, right? So
I, you know, I did a lot of work on some of our products at the beginning. I was the original coder by myself, and it was wonderful.
yes.
Right? Then then we
Yeah.
started like
Yeah.
asking for feedback and
Yeah.
getting more people involved. And I think
Right.
it became very complicated and less fun.
Because a lot of people will ask for a lot of different things,
Yeah, right.
right? So
I think, I think the challenge, the reason people say we still need programmers is
right,
the problem you're putting forth, right?
right.
Building something from scratch, building an MVP,
Hmm.
right? It's a very doable code gen problem,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
Because it's intentionally not fully integrated. It's
Right.
just whatever was required to get the MVP to work.
Sure.
Um, I think when you talk about how would you put a payment gateway into the middle of an existing product or something like
Right.
that, it's the same problem if you didn't have AI,
Mm.
right? I mean, I think people before this current rush of AI, there was already a lot of work being done on applications that could build applications,
Right.
like build a
Yeah.
website without coding skills
Correct.
and all that kind of stuff. So this expectation was being set, and a lot of those products were designed for from scratch
Hmm.
delivery
Right.
with pre-integrated payment gateways, for example,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
So you know, now we're in the real world. We built a website from scratch. We didn't use Wix or some other product that has all these integrated things. And now we want to add a gateway onto it. Well, whether it's AI or not AI, you're going to have to build some good requirements,
Right.
right? And that has been a lost art for a long time.
Hmm.
This isn't a new problem. This is a very old problem.
Right.
When I started, uh, everything was designed on paper, if you can imagine,
Right.
right? I can't, they were like hippo charts or something
Hmm.
like that. I can't remember what they were called, but literally it was a piece of paper that was pretty big,
Hmm.
and it had like pre-printed sections on it for
Right.
putting your variables in and stuff like that. And you would hand that to some master programmer who would review it before they ever let you on on some kind of terminal to do something.
Right.
There was a lot more thinking,
Yeah.
before coding, before getting an AI involved. There was a lot of thinking back in those days because there weren't really development environments. Everything was hot
Yeah.
that you touched. So, and probably with clients on it. So if you made a change, the idea that you were going to interrupt the operations that day, that evening, whatever the timing of it was, it's very high. So it's super risky.
Yeah.
And in that world, there was a lot more apprenticeship going on. Like I was a analyst. That's what they called them, right? A systems analyst. I was an analyst for a long time before I was a programmer, like a real programmer,
Right.
right? I mean, I was doing programming, but somebody else implemented it. And I think when you talk about now bringing this into AI, people who want to build stuff without coding skills are not going to be able to help very much, right? I mean, this is where the unreality of it all comes into play. I think you're going to need to take the artifact of the current code and in separate processes generate out like some kind of artifact that describes this code's relationship to the order management process, for example, where you would implement payment.
Right.
Right. You would have to be able to either take existing written narratives or produce one with AI that said, here's everything around the order process that you need to know. And here are the dependencies. And here's how we achieve like API integration now or notification integration now. This is how we do those things. Right. And you'd have to explain it all to the AI and get it into an artifact that could eventually be put into the next step in the process, right? And washed in that AI, which I think we're talking about multiple AI products.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
Each of them with their own purpose.
Yeah,
right?
their own purpose.
Yeah.
I think you'll have, like I've seen some specifically developed for like Kubernetes, right? To look at the configuration of the Kubernetes cluster and determine a problem. Now that really shouldn't happen. I mean, in the development of a from scratch cluster in Kubernetes, that could happen. But the idea that a port would not be turned on or something, probably not likely in something that you're doing every day or using every day. Like you would have uncovered that problem like pretty early on in the development process. But I mean, if you were trying to troubleshoot something as a DevOps person on a Kubernetes cluster, looking at the log files and interpreting them is what the commercial companies that sell products that do that kind of thing are doing right now. I think when you talk about implementing something new, again, we're talking about upstream, right? We're up in product management land.
Right.
And some experimentation that we've been doing is taking narratives from lots of different locations, lots of information, narratives and empirical data, right? And washing that through a process just to get out a new narrative in some kind of structured format like Gherkin or something like that, where it's more like a test case, right? Or a story, that kind of example. And the intent is to flesh out this very big understanding of what you're trying to accomplish with the AI. I think some of the challenges are really around how you get a whole team to work together on one AI, for example, in one instance.
So you can be an interesting thought process because if you look at project management today, everything is about communication and platform where you bring people together, but not much around the rigor of the requirements. That's where you could have an AI agent like a co-pilot. As you are writing the requirements, it checks it across certain other checklist. Have you thought about this? Have you thought how this impacts that, right? Or the way you're writing, you haven't given me these things for the requirement to be complete. So it could be more of an like a co-pilot as you're writing the requirement rather than it write the requirement from scratch. It could, but have a human provide feedback, right? And then structure it and make sure that it is airtight. You could come up with a requirement that clashes with what you have in the system, and that AI could point out if it has a knowledge of what the APIs look like, what's the input output, what is their limitations around things like that. Maybe a simple process. Hey, for this feature to happen, you need to do polling every second of this API.
Right.
So that could be like flagged. Hey, are you sure you want to do that? It's gonna increase your infrastructure load because now you need a high capacity database or a bandwidth and you're paying by this, right?
Yeah.
So, and that requirement couldn't be, they may not be that high in their list of things to do, right?
Right.
So that screening, I don't see any product like that out there. But the other could be culling of the requirements, because I've been in project management too, right? And the requirements starts to creep.
Yeah.
Right? How do you call them? Like, hey, this is not important. This is important. We bring that in.
Those are good questions. I mean, I think there's a process for all these steps that humans have to go through. So I think the point would be, where it kind of falls down, or in my mind with AI, is that you're going to have to feed it this information where, in the past, you knew how to do it,
Right.
After years of doing it, right? You know how to coalesce it, even if you don't understand everything about it. You could coalesce the requirements and you could show it to somebody else who understands something more specific about that payment gateway or that process, or whether we should have a WebSocket or whether we should have something else other than that kind of polling going on. Those kind of things other people can help you with. You seek them out. Like you feel like you haven't got the answer you want, so you ask another person, right? That's not going to happen in this AI process. I mean, it could, but you start stacking up like a wall of like complexities that you're going to have to overcome. So I think in the short term, it's really more about generating a narrative in a new form that's digestible, and then focusing on finding these data sources that were very hard to like use before, right? Like, let's say you had a ton of, like web-oriented data, like where are people hovering on the screen, or that kind of thing. There's a lot of tools that do that kind of thing, but when you line it up against, anecdotal responses, right? Then you got something where it's like, okay, maybe these two things go together. And then if you lay down like, here's performance, we can't do polling. We need another, solution other than that, because it's not fast enough, or it's going to have a delay process involved, or it's going to eat up too much and force us to get more memory or whatever, or more CPU or something like that. Those kind of things where you would go ask somebody's opinion, I think you could use AI. I mean, you probably still want to ask somebody's opinion.
Right? No, I think you bring up an interesting point with the heat map thing. I think you were referring to where there are eyesights or their cursors hovering, right? Because whenever the feature is created, there is a perceived importance or value, and there's a real value behind it. And AI could help collaborate those two, because it's multimodal, right? It could read data from not just what's written in the ticket, but also what's the website doing, or where people are using it. What are the
especially if it's not producing a new user interface, right? If it's
enhancing something,
if we're talking about like we want to make an architectural change or something on the back end, in that kind of situation, it becomes more difficult to apply that data in some respects, right? Because now we are talking about like abstracting away from, okay, what's really happening on the screen, which is driving why they're hovering, right? Like what's really happening, like it's taking too long, or it's not, producing exactly what they want to see because it's an event database and you're a second behind, or whatever is behind it, right? That gets to be where the AI could play a role, because it can look at this vast data set that you couldn't, and a combination of data sets, and find intersection points that makes sense, which to me gets us back to a lot of the people that support the programmer, not just the programmer, right? Like the architect that supports the programmer, the program manager, and the product manager that supports the programmer. It becomes very strategic when you need, because a lot of times you got to negotiate these answers. So
Yeah.
You come up with one, and now you got to negotiate with somebody else, a real person, not an AI, and maybe a client. And in that kind of situation, you need to have very good information about why, right? And succinct, the ability to get through that conversation quickly a lot of times gets down to whether or not you actually end up prioritizing your list or not prioritizing your list because you run out of time and you want to get to some backlog items. You can't, the meeting ends, right?
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
you're stuck for another 2 weeks not knowing what your future is. So I think that, anything that could cut down that could be big. And you and I were talking about this conversation between Zuckerberg and Nadella on stage at LlamaCon, where Nadella said, I think 25% to 30% of the code at Microsoft's been generated through AI.
Right.
And Zuckerberg blew me away saying 50%. 50%. But as we were talking, he could be talking about the 50% before the software started to be built. And like 25% up there and 25% on the back end where DevOps was involved in testing, test case generation, test data generation, and performance analysis, right? If he's holistically talking about it, 50% sounds real. Like maybe it was 10% code gen and a bunch of
other supporting processes. Yeah. You had a lot of experience with Kubernetes and the DevOps side of things. How do you see AI helping that side of the house? So we talked a lot on the upstream. Now let's talk about the downstream process of it.
Yeah. I mean, analyzing the data that you're seeing is obviously it's an area that's been tread already with machine learning. This isn't new. This isn't a new thing. I think suggesting solutions is maybe the newer value proposition.
Like patches or something, or security?
Suggesting that a patch is needed here, or like, we're seeing these errors, but we think the root cause is this, right? That kind of thing. That's a value proposition. I think a new kind of AI checking your programming of like a YAML file. Okay. That's kind of like Copilot.
Right.
Right. I mean, so we've done tests there as well in our business where, albeit it was our chief engineer, but he wrote an operator, a Kubernetes operator in Go, I believe, and produced it.
Right.
And then he took the artifacts, not the code, everything else that he compiled together and maybe a little bit more, and ran it through an AI process. And he was able to generate the operator in a couple of hours or less, right? Very fast in comparison to the hand coding, which took weeks, right, to get all the information and stuff. So, when I think about that, the weeks part, that's where I have some curiosity because he really wasn't coding for weeks, right? I mean, and this isn't even about the elapsed time part of it. It's how much time was spent getting the requirements, talking about it with other people, and that kind of thing. So I actually believe this communication process, again, it's great when you're building something on your own and it's that small and you don't have to talk to anybody, right? You can just zone out everybody except yourself and who you think the customer is. You'll probably do a lot of iteration with customers. But in a world where you got to communicate everything to get anything done, right? I mean, it's a different world, right? So if you could produce better narratives, better explanations, things that are good for the AI, but also good for the next person in the process has to perform and do some kind of job and produce some kind of usually output of some sort. I think this is where it all comes together. And in Kubernetes, I think it gets complicated to actually do something complicated, as it is with Kubernetes, right? So I mean, there's people build a cluster and it takes 30 seconds and it's done and poof, you're like, and here it is, right? And it doesn't have anything in it, right? It doesn't really do anything, but the cluster's alive. And you can see monitoring of it and stuff like that. I think when you actually build some big system with multiple clusters and stuff like that, you get into a lot of complexity that AI is not going to deal with right now.
It might add to the complexity. My experience with CodeJet has been that once it gets stuck, it starts to add layers of complexity
Yeah.
rather than find a new way of solving the problem,
Yeah.
right? How do you deal with that in DevOps world? Because each layer of complexity also equates to additional infrastructure cost or whatnot, right? So,
I mean, I think in Kubernetes, it's not like there's one way to do stuff,
right.
but there are some limitations on what you're trying to accomplish
Yeah.
in certain things like an operator,
Hmm.
right? I mean, you could go wild with it, but examples that you have of other operators that you've written, is like, trying to create some kind of structure around it or
Gotcha.
giving it boundaries.
Yeah.
I think you could produce something at least that's a starting point,
Okay.
right? Again, if you understood why you want to write the operator in the first case, and you understand what you're expecting out of the operator after it's written, it's back to the same problem we were talking about before.
Right. Right. Cool. I think we are about time.
Yeah, I believe we are.
Well, yeah, that was enlightening. I always love to talk to you. So you're a thought leader in this area, and the AI is something new, kid on the block, right? How does this two world collide and build something interesting? It's always kind of
Yeah, I
interesting
think
to
it's
see.
going to be a very interesting next 5 years in this process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
All right, thanks
Thanks,
everybody.
everyone.